Welcome in. It is so good to have you here with us for another deep dive.
Absolutely. Really glad you could join us today.
So if you've been glancing at the headlines lately, you are probably feeling that familiar sort of low-grade anxiety of information overload.
Oh, yeah. The constant barrage.
Right. We see the push notifications, the breaking news banners, the endless Twitter threads.
Just chaos.
Total chaos. It's just a constant barrage of monumental geopolitical events unfolding in the Middle East right now.
It is.
And frankly, it feels kind of impossible to untangle if you're just looking at those fragmented clips. You get the what and the when, but the 24-hour news cycle is notoriously terrible at explaining the why.
Yeah, they really missed the underlying mechanics.
Exactly. So that is our mission today. We are going to cut right through that deafening noise, step back from the frantic breaking news cycle, and uncover the hidden economic and strategic layers that are actually dictating these events.
The layers that the daily briefings almost entirely miss.
Right, which requires a completely different approach to the information.
It really does. Instead of trying to aggregate 100 different op-eds or, skimming the surface of daily press briefings, we are leaning entirely into one highly specific, incredibly rich piece of source material today.
Yes, we are.
We're breaking down a fascinating, in-depth analytical interview with international analyst Mookie Tenenbaum.
Mookie Tenenbaum, right.
And the analysis provided by Mookie Tenenbaum here connects these seemingly isolated military and political events in a way that maps out the deep underlying mechanics of global power.
It's amazing how he does it.
It's about looking past the immediate kinetic shock of a military strike and examining the ledgers, the shipping lanes, and the quiet vulnerabilities of the world's superpowers.
The insights in this analysis are going to completely reframe how you look at the current geopolitical board.
No doubt.
I mean, we're going to look at how a specific religious observance dictated the exact operational timing of a massive military strike.
Which is wild.
It is. We'll explore why, contrary to almost every historical assumption about the Middle East natural gas, is currently vastly more critical than crude oil in this specific theater.
A huge misconception there.
Yeah, and perhaps most surprisingly, we are going to trace how a targeted explosion in Tehran is mathematically designed to crash rural banks thousands of miles away in China.
It's a phenomenal chain of events to trace.
It really is.
But before we get into the actual mechanics of Mookie Tenenbaum's analysis, let's establish our framework here.
Good idea.
We are dealing with highly sensitive, actively unfolding events today. This involves polarized viewpoints and actions from the supreme leadership of the Iranian regime, the highest levels of the Israeli government, and figures within the U.S. political sphere.
A lot of heavy hitters.
Right. So just to be absolutely clear with you, our listener, our role today isn't to take a political stance or endorse any of the figures or actions mentioned. We are strictly mapping out the strategic chessboard.
Just looking at the board.
Exactly. We're impartially breaking down the geopolitical calculus and the realpolitik that Mookie Tenenbaum details in the source material.
Exactly. We are just here to examine the board and see how the pieces move.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the sheer mechanics of this unprecedented strike, because the specific timeline laid out in Mookie Tenenbaum's analysis is fascinating.
It really is.
The operation didn't happen randomly. It went down on a Saturday, specifically 9:04 a.m. Iran time.
Right.
And Tenenbaum makes a strong point that picking a Saturday morning was a highly calculated signature.
Yeah, it's a recognized operational pattern. Tenenbaum's analysis highlights a distinct historical precedent here, noting that both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu have previously shown a predilection for greenlighting major operations against Iran on Saturdays.
Wow.
When you look at intelligence and operational planning at this tier,
Right.
you're not just looking at the kinetic impact, you're analyzing the timetable.
The rhythm of it.
Exactly. The choice of a Saturday morning fits into a pre-established psychological and operational rhythm. It exploits the natural dip in readiness that occurs over a weekend, even in high alert states.
Right, because people are still people.
Yeah. It's a recognizable signature that seasoned analysts were actually anticipating, according to Tenenbaum.
I hadn't considered the psychological weight of the day of the week, but that makes perfect sense regarding the cognitive load of defense.
Definitely.
But here is the operational detail from Mookie Tenenbaum that genuinely changes how you view modern intelligence gathering.
Oh, the cameras.
Yes, leading up to this precise 9:40 a.m. strike, Israel had compromised all of Tehran's municipal traffic cameras.
Just incredible.
We're so conditioned to think of intelligence as high-altitude satellite imagery or stealth drones, but they were literally inside the traffic management system of the city.
Which is a masterstroke in blending signals intelligence with open source style monitoring.
It really is.
What's fascinating here is the sheer vulnerability of daily routine. This wasn't a quick intrusion to check a specific intersection.
No, it's persistent.
Right. For months, intelligence agencies had persistent access to this civilian infrastructure. They weren't just staring at military radar tracking airspace, they were watching the morning commutes.
It's almost mundane.
Exactly. They used the mundane, unclassified infrastructure of the city to map out the exact, precise movements happening around the residence of Supreme Leader Khamenei.
Wait, so they're basically doing pattern of life analysis using stoplight cameras.
Precisely. You learn the rhythm of the streets. You map the arrival and departure of specific motorcades, the shift changes of security personnel, the everyday patterns that surround the supreme power in the country.
Just by watching traffic.
Yeah. It essentially transforms a basic civic utility into a weapon of mass surveillance. You don't need to hack an air-gapped military network if the local traffic camera shows you exactly who is pulling into the driveway.
That is wild. And that surveillance led them to identify a highly concentrated vulnerable window, which begs the question, how do you manage to catch the entire top brass, the supreme leader and his key commanders, in one specific location?
Right.
You would assume protocol dictates they disperse during periods of high tension. But Tenenbaum brings in this crucial cultural and logistical factor. It was Ramadan.
Yeah, and the logistics of observing the fast entirely rewrite the daily schedule of the leadership.
How so?
Well, because observing Muslims must fast from sunrise until sunset, the operational reality of feeding that many high-level officials securely means they have to gather for a pre-dawn or early morning breakfast.
I see.
Tenenbaum shows how that deeply ingrained religious routine was effectively weaponized against them.
Weaponized routine.
Exactly. By gathering out of logistical necessity for the fast, they created a temporarily concentrated target environment.
But even if they are gathered for a meal, the location is what stunned me. You hear about an escalation of this magnitude, and you immediately picture the leadership deep underground in a heavily fortified bunker.
Sure.
But Tenenbaum notes Khamenei wasn't in a bunker. He was at his primary residence. How does a target of that value make that kind of security error?
Well, Tenenbaum argues it wasn't an error so much as a rigid adherence to protocol, which the intelligence apparatus exploited.
Okay.
He points out that Khamenei operates under a very specific peacetime versus wartime protocol. He traditionally only moves to his fortified bunkers during an actively declared war.
And they hadn't officially declared it yet.
Right, because this massive strike was essentially the opening salvo of this new phase. The war hadn't officially commenced in a declared sense.
So he was operating under a false sense of pre-war security.
Exactly. He was simply at his home. And the persistent intelligence gathering via those municipal traffic cameras confirmed this pattern.
They saw him there?
They knew his protocol, they knew the location, they knew the leadership was gathering for the Ramadan breakfast. It was the convergence of compromised civilian infrastructure, strict operational protocols, and religious timing that created a window where the maximum number of high-value targets were in an unfortified location.
It is a staggering sequence of intelligence failures and tactical successes when you lay it out sequentially.
It really is.
But obviously, the kinetic strike of this scale doesn't happen in a vacuum. Let's shift to the diplomatic prelude.
Yes, the negotiations.
Right. Muki Tenenbaum details a recent negotiation between Iran and the U.S. that really functioned more as a shakedown.
A shakedown is a good word for it.
The numbers presented in these initial talks are heavy. The Iranian delegation apparently sat down and immediately declared they possessed 426 tons of uranium enriched to 60%.
Which fundamentally changes the nature of the conversation. When you're dealing with nuclear enrichment, the jump to 60% is the critical threshold.
Let's actually pause there because I think people hear these percentages and assume it's a linear scale. Like getting from 0 to 60 is more than halfway to 90, which is weapons grade.
Right, right.
But the physics of enrichment don't work like that, do they?
No, they don't. And that's why 60% is the alarm bell.
Right.
In the uranium enrichment process, which is measured in what are called separative work units, or SWUs, the vast majority of the time and energy is spent getting from natural uranium, which is under 1%, up to about 20%.
That's the heavy lifting.
Exactly. Once you hit 20%, you've essentially done 90% of the physical work. Going from 20 to 60% is relatively fast.
Okay.
And the jump from 60 to 90%, which is full weapons grade, requires a fraction of the time and effort.
So 60% isn't just getting close, it's standing right on the finish line.
Exactly. Mookie Tenenbaum breaks down the math of this brinkmanship. 426 tons of uranium enriched to 60% is enough to create 11 nuclear devices.
11 bombs.
Yes. It puts them mere weeks away from a fully weaponized state. And Tenenbaum points out they weren't using this as a concession.
They weren't saying, we have this, let's dismantle it.
No. They were using this existential threat as maximum leverage, expecting massive favors and sanctions relief from the U.S. in exchange for simply pausing right before taking that final irreversible step.
The phrase Tenenbaum uses to describe the U.S. reaction in that room is brilliant. He says the U.S. realized Iran was trying to sell lost fish.
It's a perfect analogy. You're trying to sell something that's already gone bad.
Yeah.
Iran was demanding massive concessions for holding off on an action they had already functionally completed the groundwork for.
Right.
They had achieved nuclear threshold status and were using it for diplomatic extortion. The U.S. realized instantly that the negotiations were fundamentally hollow.
So what does this all mean? If you're the U.S. delegation and you realize you're dealing with a state that is weeks away from 11 nuclear weapons and has absolutely zero intention of genuinely disarming, what is the next play on the board?
Tenenbaum concludes it means the absolute failure of diplomacy and the inevitability of preemption.
Preemption.
Right. Once the lost fish nature of the talks became apparent, the U.S. had exactly one option left. They couldn't wait.
Because waiting is too dangerous.
Facing a threshold state, waiting meant risking a surprise breakout to a nuclear-armed Iran. They were forced to strike first. And this fundamentally shifted the architecture of the conflict.
How so?
Well, for decades, the U.S. and Iran have engaged in a proxy war funding militias, backing opposing factions in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. But the reality of those 426 tons forced the U.S. to abandon the proxy model and engage directly.
Which brings us to the actual strategic goals of that direct engagement. Whenever we see a strike of this magnitude in the Middle East, the immediate assumption, and it's a very Hollywood narrative, is that the goal is total regime change.
Right.
You've on the Capitol, leadership falls, and a new government steps in. But Mookie Tenenbaum strongly pushes back against that interpretation here.
He firmly dismisses it. Tenenbaum's core thesis on this point is that the strategic goal is not regime change.
All right.
Changing a deeply entrenched revolutionary regime from the outside via air power is practically impossible. The internal security apparatus is too deeply rooted.
So what is the goal then?
Tenenbaum uses a highly specific visceral term for the actual objective. The goal is to castrate the regime's capabilities.
Castrate. That is a brutal word, but it perfectly defines the modern military doctrine of capability degradation.
Yes, exactly.
It's not about removing them from the seat of power. It's about removing their ability to project that power. You take away the air defense, you degrade the enrichment facilities, you neutralize the command and control.
You render them impotent on the global stage, even if they remain in total control domestically.
Right.
And this strategy of castration over regime change is directly tied to the domestic political calculus back in the United States.
That makes sense.
Tenenbaum points to the casualty figures from the initial phases of this direct conflict. The numbers were stark. Only 6 American service members died, and tragically, Tenenbaum notes, those fatalities were the result of a friendly fire error by Kuwaiti forces, not a direct result of Iranian offensive action.
Wow. And while every single life lost is a tragedy, when you are looking at the brutal arithmetic of grand strategy and domestic approval ratings, that near-zero casualty rate from enemy fire is everything.
It is. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why remote precision warfare is the preferred tool. As long as U.S. and Israeli casualties remain at or near zero, the political cost for the administration remains incredibly low.
The public doesn't push back.
Exactly. The threshold of acceptable costs for foreign engagements has plummeted in the post-Iraq era. War becomes deeply unpopular domestically the moment casualties mount.
Right.
But a high-tech remote war that degrades a major adversary without shedding American blood. Tenenbaum notes that carries almost zero political penalty at home.
And there was a very specific data point Mookie Tenenbaum brought up regarding U.S. domestic reaction that highlights this. He points to Laura Loomer, a prominent right-wing influencer in the U.S., who is closely followed by Donald Trump.
Yes.
Now, traditionally, you might expect the America First anti-interventionist wing of the right, to fiercely oppose opening a new direct conflict in the Middle East. But she actually came out publicly in full support of the strike, saying, "Finish the job."
Right. And looking at that objectively as a data point and remembering our rule here without endorsing the politics involved, it perfectly illustrates Tenenbaum's broader analytical point about modern domestic political dynamics.
It really does.
The widespread fear of a massive reflexive anti-war backlash in the U.S. whenever military action is taken is largely outdated, provided certain conditions are met.
Which are low casualties.
Yes. Tenenbaum argues that the American public historically cares very little about foreign interventions unless they are directly attacked or suffer high troop casualties. Because this strike was precise, targeted, and low cost in terms of U.S. lives, the domestic base is largely supportive or at the very least indifferent.
And that indifference is functionally a blank check.
It is.
It gives the military a wide mandate to continue the castration strategy without the administration fearing a loss of voters.
Exactly.
But let's look at the other side of the board. The U.S. strikes, the leadership takes a massive hit. Here's where it gets really interesting. What happens internally in Tehran? Power vacuums are notoriously volatile.
Extreme.
If the top tier is eliminated or incapacitated, who actually takes the reins?
It's a highly complex internal mechanism. It's not a simple chain of command where the vice president steps in. According to Tenenbaum, the succession is governed by the Assembly of Experts, a selection committee currently comprised of 88 specific clerics.
88 clerics.
Yes, this body holds the ultimate constitutional authority to choose the next supreme leader.
I remember immediately after the strikes, there was a flurry of speculation in Western media that Khamenei's grandson might be elevated to power. He's generally perceived by outside observers as somewhat of a moderate, and there was a lot of hopeful commentary that this could signal a softening of the regime.
Which Tenenbaum completely dismisses as Western wishful thinking.
Really?
Yeah, he fundamentally misreads the internal power dynamics of the regime. Those 88 clerics are not going to pivot to a moderate reformist during a period of existential crisis.
They circle the wagons.
Exactly. In entrenched revolutionary states, power vacuums almost always favor the hardliners. Tenenbaum suggests the far more realistic candidates are either Khamenei's own son, which ensures hereditary continuation of the hardline legacy, or another deeply conservative Klemmich from within the core apparatus.
So no big pivot.
The ultimate prediction here is that there will be absolutely no immediate or significant change in Iran's overarching geopolitical policy. The figurehead might change, but the ideological engine remains identical.
That's a sobering reality check for anyone expecting a swift democratic revolution from within the elite ranks.
It is.
Speaking of those entrenched figures, Tenenbaum brought up a very specific, highly controversial name when discussing the regime's old guard, Ahmad Vahidi.
Yes. Vahidi is highlighted because his presence connects current events to a decades-old international terror event, the 1994 AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires, which targeted a Jewish community center.
Horrible event.
Vahidi has been formally accused by the Argentine justice system and has had Interpol alerts issued against him for his role as a key architect of that attack.
And there's a fascinating, albeit grim, quirk of Argentine law regarding this that Tenenbaum explores.
Right.
Under their legal framework, when a suspect dies, they are fundamentally unimputed. The charges are completely dropped, and the legal case against that individual is permanently closed because you cannot legally try a deceased person.
It's a strict legal technicality. But Tenenbaum focuses on the broader philosophical concept of consequence here. If a figure like Vahidi is eliminated in these kinetic strikes, he avoids a formal legal judgment.
There is no trial.
No courtroom reckoning. However, Tenenbaum offers a profound observation on behalf of the victims of the AMIA bombing, noting that for those victims, even if it circumvents the traditional judicial process, justice was done late, but it was done.
Wow.
It's a heavy reflection on how raw geopolitical force sometimes acts as the final arbiter of decades-old international crimes when diplomatic and legal avenues fail.
It's a very heavy concept,
Yeah.
and it brings up the immediate concern of retaliation.
Sure.
If the regime's leadership is backed into a corner and they have a proven historical capability of orchestrating external operations, like the AMIA bombing, should we be anticipating a wave of Iranian proxy attacks on what are called soft targets?
Yeah.
Specifically, there is concern about them lashing out in Latin America, where Hezbollah and the Quds Force have historically maintained networks.
Well, Tenenbaum provides a very logically grounded no to that concern.
Really, no soft targets.
We are unlikely to see a wave of terror attacks against soft targets in South America or similar regions right now, and the reasoning comes down to bandwidth and survival.
Yeah, with.
Yeah. External terror operations require a stable logistical base funding and a position of relative security at home to project that ideological power outward. The regime is currently fighting for pure basic survival.
It's a resource allocation problem.
Yeah.
Expending dwindling resources to bomb an embassy in South America doesn't stop precision munitions from hitting Tehran.
Exactly.
It doesn't reconstitute their nuclear program. It's a strategic distraction they literally cannot afford.
Furthermore, Tenenbaum addresses the ultimate nightmare scenario, which is an Iranian terror attack directly on U.S. soil. This is viewed as a definitive regime-ending red line.
The ultimate red line.
If Iran were to attack the American homeland, it would instantly erase all the partisan political division in the United States. It would immediately unite squabbling politicians across the aisle in absolute unmitigated outrage.
And that unification would guarantee a political mandate for the absolute total destruction of the Iranian regime.
Yes. Tenenbaum argues that the Iranian leadership, despite their fiery public rhetoric, understands this calculus perfectly. Their primary directive is self-preservation. A soft target attack on the U.S. guarantees their annihilation.
So the threat of external terrorism is actually lower now because they are structurally contained by the threat of total destruction.
Paradoxically, yes.
That is a fascinating pivot in the risk assessment. Now let's transition from the military and political maneuvering into the macroeconomic fallout, because this is where Mookie Tenenbaum's source material completely upends the conventional wisdom.
Oh yeah, this is where it gets really counterintuitive.
When the average person hears escalating war in the Middle East, the immediate reflexive assumption is crude oil prices are going to skyrocket.
Right.
We picture the 1970s oil shocks. But Tenenbaum offers a massive reality check on that assumption.
He entirely dismantles the crude oil crisis narrative in this specific context. Tenenbaum explicitly states that right now, the global oil supply is largely insulated.
Insulated.
And this is backed by current market data. There is currently an excess of oil in the global market. The elasticity of global oil production is much higher than it was in the 20th century.
So there's plenty to go around.
Plus, OPEC had already proactively lowered their production quotas to try and stabilize prices before this conflict even erupted.
Right, there's a buffer built into the market. The price fluctuations we are seeing, Tenenbaum mentions it bouncing around the 6% to 14% range, are well within an acceptable, manageable band for the macroeconomy.
It's not a systemic shock.
So if crude oil isn't the primary economic weapon in this theater, what
Yep.
is? We have to pivot to the real immediate crisis, and it's all about liquefied natural gas, or LNG, specifically coming out of Qatar.
Yes. This is where maritime geography becomes the most important factor in the global economy. To understand the LNG crisis, you have to look at the bathymetry and the layout of the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Tenenbaum paints a very restrictive picture. On a standard map, the strait looks reasonably wide, about 23 kilometers across.
That sounds like plenty of room.
But that is highly deceptive for commercial shipping. Because of the depth requirements and the safe transit corridors, only a very narrow 3-kilometer strip of that water is actually navigable for massive deep draft cargo vessels.
Just 3 kilometers.
Yes.
That is an incredibly tight needle to thread. Imagine these colossal QMax LNG carriers, which are some of the largest, most volatile ships ever constructed, essentially floating bombs of supercooled gas trying to navigate a 3-kilometer channel.
It's terrifying.
They have to zigzag through this specific, predictable pathway.
And that geographical necessity makes them profoundly vulnerable to asymmetric warfare. Because they are forced into this predictable choke point, these massive carriers are essentially sitting ducks for coastal anti-ship missiles, fast attack swarms, or naval mines.
The insurance premiums from underwriters like Lloyd's of London would become astronomical, assuming they'd insure the transit at all.
The risk is simply too high. And the result? Tenenbaum states, plainly, the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed to this traffic. The shipping companies aren't risking the assets.
They just sit there.
The vessels are anchored, sitting idle on either side of the strait. The global LNG supply chain is severed at a 3-kilometer bottleneck.
So you have millions of cubic meters of LNG just sitting at anchor. And Tenenbaum addresses where this specific gas was actually bound, which corrects another major public misconception.
Right.
Given the recent history with Russian pipelines, a lot of people assume all Middle Eastern energy is desperately needed in Europe. But this Qatari LNG wasn't down for Europe.
No.
Its primary destination was Asia, specifically Taiwan, Japan, and the manufacturing hubs of China.
This raises an important question. How does a sudden deficit of natural gas in Asia impact the tangible, everyday materials that construct our modern world?
Right.
This is where Tenenbaum introduces a brilliant industrial concept. He looks at aluminum production, referring to the metal by a very specific, highly accurate industry term, liquid electricity.
Liquid electricity. It's such a perfect descriptor.
It really is.
If you look at the mechanics of smelting aluminum from bauxite or using the Hall-Héroult process, it requires an absolutely gargantuan continuous input of electrical power.
Massive amounts.
The smelters cannot be turned off without the metal solidifying and destroying the equipment. They require so much baseline power, which in Asia is heavily generated by burning natural gas, that the final ingot of aluminum is essentially solidified packaged electricity.
That's incredible.
You aren't just exporting a metal, you're exporting the energy used to make it.
Exactly. And Tenenbaum traces the immediate cascading domino effect. The Strait of Hormuz is closed, the LNG carriers are anchored, the gas doesn't reach the power plants in Asia.
Which means
No gas means grid constraints, which means no continuous power for the massive aluminum smelters. No power means production halts.
And because aluminum is a foundational base layer material for the global economy, essential for everything from aerospace engineering and automotive frames to commercial construction and consumer packaging, the sudden supply shock is catastrophic.
Huge.
Tenenbaum explains that the price of aluminum, along with heavily energy-dependent metals like iron and steel, absolutely skyrockets on the global commodities market.
The invisible strings of the macroeconomy are just incredible to trace. The Strait of Hormuz closes, and suddenly the cost to manufacture a laptop in Taipei or frame a house in the U.S. goes through the roof.
But in every geopolitical crisis, the reshuffling of the board creates a winner. Mookie Tenenbaum identifies a very clear economic beneficiary of this LNG bottleneck.
Yes, he points directly to the United States.
Right.
The U.S. has spent the last decade building out massive export terminal capacity for its own domestically produced liquefied natural gas.
They saw this coming.
With the massive Qatari supply trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. suddenly finds itself holding a virtual monopoly on secure available LNG on the global market.
A total monopoly.
Because the Asian manufacturing economies desperately need that gas to prevent industrial stalling, the U.S. producers can command absolute premium pricing.
Wow.
The Asian markets are effectively cornered into buying American gas at whatever price the market dictates because their primary, cheaper alternative is currently trapped by the threat of Iranian munitions.
It is a massive structural windfall for the U.S. energy sector, born entirely out of that tiny geographical choke point.
It really is.
Now let's move into the final, and frankly, the most staggering segment of this entire strategic breakdown. Because everything we've unpacked so far, the precise strikes the nuclear threshold dynamics, the severed gas supply lines. Tenenbaum argues that all of this is actually building toward one ultimate hidden systemic target.
The real target.
But before we get to the real target, Tenenbaum takes a moment to brutally dismantle a major distraction narrative regarding Venezuela.
Right. There was a prevailing theory circulating in geopolitical circles that U.S. actions in the Middle East, coupled with some perceived sanctions leniency elsewhere, were all part of a grand pivot to secure replacement crude oil from Venezuela.
Which Tenenbaum unequivocally debunks using strict refining economics and production data.
Completely.
He argues that the Venezuelan narrative is merely a convenient pretext, a smokescreen hiding the real strategic board.
The breakdown of Venezuelan crude is pretty merciless. He describes their oil as terrible. It's heavy, highly acidic, sour crude.
Not the good stuff.
No. It is incredibly expensive and difficult to refine. You can't just pump it into a standard refinery geared for light, sweet crude. It's mostly utilized for producing asphalt and heavy fuel oils, not the high-grade distillates needed to fuel a modern logistics network.
Furthermore, when you look at the sheer volume, Venezuela's output is statistically irrelevant to the grand strategy. Despite the disproportionate media focus on Caracas, Tenenbaum notes that Venezuela supplies a minuscule 1% to 2% of China's massive aggregate energy demands.
Just a drop in the bucket.
In terms of global production rankings, Venezuela sits somewhere around 14th or 15th. They simply do not possess the market share or the crude quality to dictate the grand strategic maneuvering of the United States. To understand the actual conflict, Tenenbaum insists we have to completely discard the Venezuelan distraction.
So if it's not about securing heavy crude from South America, what is the actual centerpiece of this conflict?
Here's where Tenenbaum reveals a massive, deeply vulnerable dependency in China's energy architecture. While Venezuela provides a rounding error of 1%, China quietly imports a staggering 20% of its total oil supply directly from Iran.
20%.
And the crucial component here is the nature of this transaction. Because Iran operates under heavy, comprehensive international sanctions, exporting their oil is illegal under standard global financial systems.
So how do they move it?
They rely on a ghost fleet of tankers turning off their transponders to move the product. Because it is illicit and carries immense logistical risk, Iran is forced to sell this crude at a steep discount just to move it. Tenenbaum highlights that China is quietly absorbing this massive volume at a 20% discount compared to global Brent crude prices. It functions as an incredibly cheap, illicit energy subsidy that continuously fuels their industrial expansion.
But the Chinese central government and state-owned enterprises can't just openly wire billions of dollars to Tehran for sanctioned oil without triggering massive secondary sanctions on their own primary banking sector.
Exactly. They can't leave a paper trail.
So Tenenbaum details the elaborate shadow architecture China has constructed to manage this. The imports are routed through private independent refineries within China, often referred to as teapots.
Teapots.
These independent entities purchase the discounted crude, refine it domestically, and feed the final product into the Chinese industrial machine, keeping the state's hands technically clean.
This is where Mookie Tenenbaum pulls all these seemingly disparate threads, the military kinetics, the maritime logistics, and the shadow economy, into one brilliant, devastating aha moment.
It's all connected.
Let's trace the sequence back. The U.S. initiates direct strikes in Iran. The regional security architecture destabilizes. The shipping lanes around the Persian Gulf become prohibitive risk zones.
Right?
The immediate physical result? That vital flow of discounted, illicit Iranian crude to the Chinese independent refineries is physically severed. The tankers stop arriving.
But here is the fatal economic trap that Tenenbaum identifies. The oil isn't arriving at the ports, but those independent Chinese refineries, they already paid for the cargo.
Paid in full.
In the shadow economy of sanctioned goods, you don't get net 60 payment terms. They had to pay up front to secure that massive 20% discount.
And that upfront capital requirement exposes the fundamental fragility of the system. Tenenbaum asks the critical question: where did these independent refineries acquire the massive liquidity needed to purchase entire fleets of crude oil up front?
That's a huge amount of cash.
They couldn't use the major state-owned banks due to international compliance. So they financed these purchases through massive, highly leveraged loans from regional rural banks, specifically located in what Tenenbaum identifies as China's second most important economic province.
It's an economic house of cards built on maritime stability. The collapse is mathematically inevitable, the maritime road is blocked, the crude oil doesn't arrive.
The independent refineries have no feedstock to refine.
If they can't produce and sell fuel, their cash flow immediately goes to zero. And if their cash flow is zero, they absolutely cannot service the massive debt they owe to those rural banks.
The masterstroke of this entire geopolitical strategy lies exactly here. Those rural Chinese banks, deeply over-leveraged on non-performing loans to stalled refineries, face immediate insolvency.
They will go bankrupt.
But in a highly centralized, heavily managed economy like China's ages, the failure of regional banking institutions is about far more than just wiped out equity.
Much more.
Tenenbaum argues it threatens the most fragile and vital component of the entire state apparatus: domestic public trust.
If rural citizens cannot access their deposits, it shatters confidence in the banking sector from the ground up.
It risks social contagion. It forces the central government in Beijing to desperately intervene, burning massive amounts of state capital and political goodwill to bail out the provinces and prevent a localized failure from cascading into a nationwide systemic financial panic.
It is truly a masterpiece of strategic design when you see it laid out like that by Tenenbaum.
It really is. It starts with a precision munition hitting a target in Tehran, and the final domino falls in the lobby of a rural credit cooperative in a Chinese province.
Based on this entire sequence, Tenenbaum presents a grand unifying thesis. When you strip away the daily noise, the regional skirmishes, and the localized political rhetoric, there is functionally only one foundational conflict occurring on the global stage right now.
Just one.
It is the systemic hegemonic struggle between the United States and China. everything else. Every proxy skirmish, every trade tariff, and yes, even a monumental direct conflict involving Iran is ultimately a secondary theater.
A secondary theater.
It is a highly complex, interconnected maneuver designed to exert maximum systemic economic pressure on the true, ultimate adversary.
It is an incredibly cohesive, if sobering, framework for viewing global events. It demands that we elevate our perspective.
We have to look past the immediate shock of the explosions and trace the fault lines through the commodity ledgers, the maritime shipping lanes, and the hidden structural vulnerabilities of the global economic system.
What a phenomenal journey we just took through Mookie Tenenbaum's source material. We started by examining the intersection of compromised municipal traffic cameras and the logistics of a religious fast.
We mapped out the terrifying velocity of uranium enrichment and the brinkmanship of threshold states.
We navigated the bathymetry of the Strait of Hormuz, unpacking why natural gas dictates the global supply chain and how aluminum functions as liquid electricity.
And finally, we followed the physical disruption of a shadow oil fleet to uncover how a localized kinetic strike in the Middle East is mathematically engineered to trigger a systemic banking crisis in rural China.
And this brings all of this high-level grand strategy right back to you, the listener, and the reality of your everyday life.
Yes. This analysis powerfully demonstrates that geopolitics isn't just an abstract concept happening over there on the international news networks.
The mechanics we just mapped out directly dictate the heating bill for your home, the wholesale costs of the aluminum in the products you buy, and the shifting tectonic plates of the macroeconomy that ultimately secure or threaten global market stability.
It is a masterclass in recognizing the invisible strings that connect a Saturday morning operational timetable in Tehran directly to the broader global supply chain.
It absolutely is. And we want to leave you with a final lingering thought inspired by the incredible depth of this source material.
We have just traced how shutting down a highly specific 3-kilometer navigable strip of water in the Persian Gulf can mathematically threaten to collapse regional banks and shatter domestic public trust in a massive superpower thousands of miles away.
It forces us to ask a really difficult question. In an era of hyper-connected, deeply intertwined global supply chains and shadow financial networks, how truly sovereign or insulated is any single nation's economy today?
When a next seemingly isolated geopolitical crisis flashes across your screen, you have to wonder what invisible dominoes are already falling quietly and unstoppably right in your own backyard.
That is a profound question to consider as you watch the news cycle this week. Thank you so much for joining us as we work through this incredible analysis.
We encourage you to keep looking past the daily headlines, keep questioning the surface narratives, and keep seeking out the deeper mechanical connections.
Absolutely. Keep digging. Thank you for listening, and we will see you on the next Deep Dive.